私は今、霊を呼んでいます。カーレン、エストラディン、イコナ、プリスター、ベノラ、ベノラ。来たのね。
パナウイチサリト
パナ
ウイチサリト。
ちょっと待ってくれないな。パナウイチ
サリト。
サリト。サリト。ほうほうほうほうほう、それは確かこういう意味じゃないかと思うな。我が死は我が最大の予言なり。
誰なんだ？どこから来た？
私を
ミスカマカス。嵐のマニとミスカマカスを捕らえよう。輪から出すな。川のマニと我を助けよう。ミスカマカスを抑えてくれ。
Every 10 or 15 years, a film is produced that is so overwhelming, so forceful in its impact, that it becomes deeply embedded in the mind and changes for all time those who see it. We think The Psychic is such a film. Its intensity may be more than some wish to be exposed to, and those people should be forewarned. Just imagine how frightening it is to suddenly find that you can see into the future. Much more terrifying it is to see in that future your own murder. And then, worst of all, no one will believe you. Jennifer O'Neill is the psychic.
Five strangers walk into an underground crypt. They are tourists. They are calm. And then a figure in dark robes steps out of the shadows and tells each one of them exactly how they are going to die. You did not need the title. You already knew. The 1970s produced something that no other decade in American or British cinema has fully replicated since. A category of horror film that was not content to simply frighten you and let you go home. These were films built around a specific and deeply unsettling proposition that the supernatural was not a matter of belief, but of inevitability, that the forces operating just beneath the surface of the ordinary world had been there long before you arrived, and would still be there long after you were gone, and that your awareness of them changed absolutely nothing about what was coming. You grew up in the shadow of that idea. Maybe you caught these late at night on cable when the rest of the house had gone quiet, and the television light was the only thing between you and the dark. Maybe the VHS cover art alone was enough to make you pause before you pulled it off the shelf. Maybe you watched one of them at the wrong age, and spent the following week convincing yourself that what you felt was not what you actually felt. Tonight we are going back to 7 of those films. 7 occult and supernatural horror pictures from the 1970s that understood fear not as a monster in the hallway but as a weight, something ancient and patient and completely indifferent to whether you believed in it or not. One of these films starred one of the most celebrated actors of his generation and nearly disappeared from cinema history the moment it was released. And one of these films contains a performance so specific and so quietly devastating that the actor who gave it later said the role helped him survive the worst period of his own life. Somewhere in this list is a scene that is going to put you back in that room, at that age, in the dark, with the volume low enough that nobody else would wake up.
This woman is having a love affair with the supernatural.
I'm here, Nikki.
Baby, how I want you.
Something has disturbed him. Something powerful. Very powerful.
Piper Laurie was frightening in Carrie. She is terrifying as Ruby. Christened in blood, raised in sin, she's sweet 16. Let the party begin.
It's here. It's very strong.
First, there was The Exorcist, then The Omen and Carrie. But nothing you have ever seen before could prepare you for what you are going to see in Ruby. Starring Piper Laurie.
It was never Jake. It was always you. You believe me now, don't you, Nicky? You have to believe me now. I did it for you, Nicky. Look what I did.
Stuart Whitman. Roger Davis.
The presence is real, with motives of his own. Leslie is a natural medium. What I'm afraid of now is that the presence may be powerful enough to act without the benefit of Leslie's mind.
And introducing Janet Baldwin as Ruby's daughter. Ruby will take you further into the world of the supernatural than any film has ever dared.
Not every ghost story announces itself. Some of them set up a drive, in theater in the Florida swamps, and hire the men who killed you to run the concession stand, and then they wait. Ruby arrived in 1977, directed by Curtis Harrington, and it is one of the stranger hybrids the decade produced, part mob picture, part possession film, part Southern Gothic fever. Dream held together almost entirely by the presence of Piper Laurie, who had just come off Carrie, and who brought to this role the same quality she brought to that one. The specific gravity of a woman carrying something she was never meant to carry alone. Ruby Claire is a former gun mole running a decaying drive. In theater staffed by the ex-mobsters who murdered her lover 16 years earlier. Her daughter Leslie was born mute the night her father died. And now, as Leslie's 16th birthday approaches, the men around Ruby are beginning to die in ways that no insurance adjuster is going to be able to explain. The film tapped into something the late 1970s understood instinctively, that the past does not stay buried, that the people we wrong do not simply disappear because we stop thinking about them, and that the spaces we build to contain our guilt, the businesses, the routines, the carefully maintained distance from what we did, are far less solid than they appear from the outside. Harrington shoots the swamp locations with a dreamlike unease that makes the film feel less like a story being told, and more like a memory trying to surface. The moment that does not leave you is quieter than you expect. It is Leslie, standing perfectly still in the theater light, and the expression on her face that belongs to someone who has been waiting a very long time and has finally run out of patience. It is not threatening exactly. It is worse than that. It is certain. Ruby was largely dismissed on release, filed away as a low-rent Exorcist imitation, and left there, which is the kind of critical verdict that tends to stick to films that are doing something more interesting than the category they get assigned to. What it leaves behind is not mythology or franchise, but a single sustained feeling that the dead are not gone, that they are simply waiting for the right vessel, and that love and revenge, when they belong to the same person, are almost impossible to tell apart. Ruby's ghost came back through someone who shared his blood. The film that follows it takes a different, and in some ways more disorienting approach. What if the dead came back through you, and what if you had no way of knowing whether what you were experiencing was visitation or simply the slow unraveling of your own mind?
I didn't mean what I said back there.
That voice must belong to the man that I was.
I didn't know what I was saying.
I must be the man playing tennis in those dreams, driving that car, swimming in that lake.
Now you're telling me you've been reincarnated.
Right.
Take it from me. When you're dead, you're dead.
Suppose you knew who you had been in a previous life.
What is this, some kind of a joke or something? You've signed the name of the deceased, Jeffrey Curtis.
Where you had lived,
Mrs. Curtis, the old lady who lives here. She's been away for years.
whom you had loved,
That was my husband, Jeff. He died a long time ago.
I know.
how you had died.
No, Marcia! No!
What then? The reincarnation of Peter Proud. The best-selling novel is now an electrifying motion picture. The reincarnation of Peter Proud. The story of a man's obsessive search for a prior existence.
I know I've been here before.
Jeff, she thinks you're her son.
The dreams begin in water. A man swimming at night in a lake he has never seen, in a body that is not his own, and somewhere above the surface a woman is watching and waiting, and what she is holding in her hands is not something she brought to the water by accident. The reincarnation of Peter Proud came out in 1975, directed by J. Lee Thompson, and it arrived at precisely the right cultural moment. The mid-70s were saturated with a particular kind of spiritual anxiety, the growing mainstream suspicion that the self was not a fixed and reliable thing, that consciousness might extend backward and forward in ways that Western rationalism had no framework for, and that the life you were living might carry debts from lives you had no memory of living. Peter Proud is a California college professor who begins experiencing increasingly vivid and specific dreams of another man's life, another man's death, and another man's marriage in a small town in Massachusetts he has never visited. When he finds the town, he finds the widow, and he finds the daughter. And the film becomes something that no clean genre label has ever quite accounted for. Part supernatural horror, part psychological unraveling, part tragedy about the way the past refuses to release its grip on the living, regardless of how many lifetimes separate them. Jerry Goldsmith's score moves through the film, like something half, remembered, present, and not quite present, always arriving one beat before the dread that follows it. The moment that crystallizes everything the film is doing happens in a boat on the lake. Peter is there. The water is the same water from the dream. And the look on his face as recognition and terror arrive simultaneously is one of the most precisely realized expressions of supernatural dread in the decade's entire horror catalog. Because it is not the look of someone seeing a monster. It is the look of someone realizing that they have been here before, and that knowing that changes nothing at all about what comes next. The reincarnation of Peter Proud has never received the serious reappraisal it deserves, despite a cast that includes Margot Kidder delivering one of her most controlled and unsettling performances, and despite a score that belongs in the same conversation as the great horror soundtracks of the decade. It was adapted from Max Ehrlich's novel of the same name, and the film honors the book's central dread faithfully, that justice, when it operates across lifetimes, is not interested in mercy, and that some endings, no matter how many times they are deferred, are simply not avoidable. Peter Proud was haunted by a past life he could not escape, no matter how far he traveled from it. The film that comes next removes the travel entirely. Its horror is not something you pursue across state lines. It is something that grows on you, literally, in the place where you thought you were most safe, inside your own body.
Watashi wa ima, rei o yonde imasu. Karen, Estradim, Icona, Prista, Benora, Benora. 来たのね。
タナ
ウイチサリト。
ちょっと待ってくれないな。タナウイチ
サリト。
サリト。サリト。ほうほうほうほうほう、それは確かこういう意味じゃないかと思うな。我が死は我が最大の予言なり。
誰なんだ？ どこから来た？
私を
見すかまかす。早く先生を呼べ。嵐のマニとミスカマカスを捕らえよう。輪から出すが、川のマニと我を助けよう。ミスカマカスを抑えてくれ。
The doctors call it a tumor. The X-rays show it growing at a rate that no medical textbook has a category for, and then it moves. The Manitou arrived in 1978, directed by William Girdler, and it is the kind of film that the 1970s produced with a specific and unrepeatable confidence. The confidence that an idea this bizarre, executed with total sincerity, could function as genuine horror rather than accidental comedy. A woman named Karen enters a San Francisco hospital with a growth on the back of her neck that turns out to be not a tumor but a fetus, the reincarnation of a 400-year-old Native American shaman named Misquamacus, working his way back into the world through a host he did not ask permission to use. Tony Curtis plays Harry Erskine, Karen's ex-boyfriend, and a low-rent fortune-teller who finds himself the only person willing to treat the situation as the supernatural emergency it actually is, while every medical professional around him insists on looking for a rational explanation that keeps not being there. The film connected to something the late 1970s were quietly grappling with, the growing awareness that the land American prosperity was built on carried histories that had not been resolved, grievances that had not been addressed, and forces that did not recognize the authority of the institutions that had displaced them. Girdler shoots this material with a deadpan commitment that transforms the film's considerable absurdity into something that functions, in its best moments, as a genuinely unsettling meditation on what it means to be inhabited by something ancient and furious. The moment the film refuses to let you look away from is the S-Ant sequence, where a table of ordinary people in an ordinary room makes contact with something that is under no obligation to behave like the spirits they were expecting. The temperature in the room drops, the table moves, and then something answers that is not what anyone in that room was prepared to speak to, and the silence that follows it lands heavier than any sound the film has produced up to that point. Girdler died in a helicopter crash in the Philippines shortly before The Manitou was released, scouting locations for his next film, which means this extraordinary and deeply strange piece of work is the last thing he ever completed. The horror community lost a filmmaker who is clearly developing into something genuinely difficult to categorize. What The Manitou leaves behind is not just its wild finale or its commitment to ideas that most studios would have walked away from. It leaves behind the question that sits underneath all of its supernatural machinery. If something ancient enough and angry enough decided to come back through you, through your own body, through the flesh you thought belonged entirely to yourself, what exactly would you use to stop it? The Manitou brought its ancient evil up through the body from the inside. The film that follows it works in the opposite direction entirely, pushing its horror inward through the mind, through vision, through the specific and vertiginous terror of a woman who can see what is coming and cannot convince a single person around her that what she sees is real.
Every 10 or 15 years, a film is produced that is so overwhelming, so forceful in its impact, that it becomes deeply embedded in the mind and changes for all time those who see it. We think The Psychic is such a film. Its intensity may be more than some wish to be exposed to, and those people should be forewarned. Just imagine how frightening it is to suddenly find that you can see into the future. Much more terrifying it is to see in that future your own murder. And then, worst of all, no one will believe you. Jennifer O'Neill is the psychic.
She sees it before it happens. The crack in the wall, the color of the light in the room, the hand reaching toward something that has been hidden for a very long time. And when she finds the wall and opens it, everything she saw is exactly where the vision told her it would be. That is not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is what the vision did not show her. Lucio Fulci directed The Psychic in 1977. 4 years before he became the filmmaker the horror world remembers him as the architect of visceral and relentless gore that defined the Italian horror movement of the early 1980s. This film is something quieter, and in many ways more sophisticated than anything that followed it in his catalog. Virginia is a woman with genuine clairvoyant ability, which in the hands of a lesser filmmaker would be the solution to the film's central mystery. Fulci understands that it is actually the problem. Virginia can see fragments of events with perfect accuracy, but fragments assembled out of sequence and without context are not knowledge. They are a map drawn in a language you can almost read, leading you toward a destination you cannot fully see until you are already standing in it. The 1970s were processing a particular cultural discomfort with psychiatric authority, the growing public skepticism toward institutions that pathologized anything they could not measure. And The Psychic places its protagonist directly inside that tension, a woman whose perceptions are demonstrably accurate, and who is treated throughout as someone whose grip on reality requires professional management. Fulci shoots the film's vision sequences with a fragmented, disorienting rhythm that puts the audience inside Virginia's experience, rather than observing it from a comfortable distance. Which means that when the pieces begin to fall into place in the third act, the resolution arrives not as relief, but as the specific dread of watching someone walk directly into something they almost had enough information to avoid. The scene that defines the film is almost entirely without movement. Virginia standing in a renovated room, looking at a wall she has seen in her visions, understanding in real time that the image in her mind and the space in front of her are the same place. Fabio Frizzi's score drops to almost nothing beneath it. The camera holds. And the silence between what she knows and what she does not yet know is the most concentrated piece of supernatural dread Fulci ever put on screen. The Psychic was released in America in a heavily edited version that removed much of the film's carefully constructed tension and retitled it with a poster designed to suggest something entirely different from what the film actually was. It found its audience slowly and reluctantly, the way that the best films from this period often did, through late-night cable and battered VHS copies passed between people who had seen it and could not stop thinking about it. What it leaves behind is a question that has no comfortable answer. If you could see the future clearly enough to know that something terrible was coming, but not clearly enough to know exactly what form it would take or who it would take from you, would that vision be a gift or simply a longer and more detailed version of the same helplessness everyone else is already living with? Virginia's visions gave her just enough information to be dangerous to herself. The film that follows it belongs to a man who has too much information entirely. A man who has spent his entire life accumulating evidence of his own capacity for destruction, and who has arrived, by the time we meet him, at a conclusion about himself that no one around him is willing to accept until it is far too late.
In ancient legend, Medusa was one of the 3 Gorgon monsters created to do battle with the gods. Anyone looking into the eyes of Medusa was instantly turned to stone.
I have a gift for disaster.
You seem to have survived it.
I don't mean for me. I mean for others.
He was found in his flat last night.
Dead?
Not quite, but he had been badly assaulted.
But I assume he'll be all right then?
He will never be all right again.
I did not set fire to my school. I did not touch the brakes of my father's car.
Therefore?
Therefore, there must be something else.
And was there something else?
What else could there be?
I made it happen.
But you couldn't cause an accident miles away.
I made that accident happen.
If you say coincidence to me, I will drive my fist through your face.
Somewhere deep within what's left of that brain, something is going on. It's grown stronger almost every hour.
You know more about that brain than anyone. What is going on?
I don't know.
I made that school burn. The children, all of them. What am I? How can I will death?
Could any of the other incidents Morlar felt responsible for be called disasters?
Well, yes, one of them could be described that way.
Were there any deaths involved?
Yes.
Catastrophe.
He is lying in a hospital bed, his skull fractured, technically unconscious, and the airplane on the television screen in front of him is about to crash into a building. He does not reach for the remote. He does not need to. The Medusa Touch arrived in 1978, directed by Jack Gold, starring Richard Burton in a role that suited him in ways that nobody involved in the production fully anticipated. John Morlar is a writer who has spent his entire adult life accumulating a private and meticulous record of every disaster he believes he caused. From the death of his nanny in childhood, to plane crashes, to the collapse of buildings full of people he had never met and had no conscious reason to wish harm upon. He is not a villain in the conventional sense. He is something more disturbing than that. A man who has looked at the evidence of his own existence with complete intellectual honesty and arrived at a conclusion that the world around him is structurally unwilling to accommodate. A French detective named Brunel, played by Lino Ventura, with the specific weariness of a man who has seen everything and is now being asked to process something his entire career did not prepare him for, pieces together Morlar's history through interviews with psychiatrists and colleagues, and a psychiatrist played by Lee Remick, who understood what Morlar was telling her and chose, for reasons the film examines with uncomfortable precision, not to fully believe him. The 1970s were saturated with a distrust of power, and the people who held it, the post. Watergate's certainty that the men running things were not the men who should be running things, and the Medusa Touch takes that anxiety to its terminal conclusion. What if one of them genuinely could not be stopped, not because of institutional protection or political cover, but because the force operating through him was simply beyond the reach of anything civilization had developed to contain it? The scene that does not leave you is Burton in the hospital bed, eyes open, the television showing the approach of the aircraft, and his absolute stillness in the frame. Gold holds the shot long enough that you understand, before anything happens, that what you are watching is not a man watching television. It is something considerably older than that, wearing a man's face, doing what it has always done, and finding the doing of it entirely unremarkable. The Medusa Touch vanished from theaters almost immediately after its release, and spent decades in the category of films that serious horror audiences discussed in the specific tone reserved for things that deserved better than they received. Burton's performance here belongs in the same conversation as his most celebrated stage work, a coiled and precisely calibrated portrait of a man who has made peace with what he is, in a way that is far more unsettling than any amount of visible menace could produce. What the film leaves behind is the question it never directly asks, but never stops implying. If the capacity for this kind of destruction exists inside a human mind, and if that capacity cannot be reliably identified or contained before it finds expression, then the distinction between a monster and a man becomes considerably less stable than any of us would prefer it to be. Morlar's power operated at a distance, impersonal, and vast and directed at strangers. The two films that close this list bring the horror back inside four walls, back into rooms full of people who should have been safe, and demonstrate with quiet devastation exactly what the supernatural looks like when it has nowhere left to hide, and neither do you.
The most terrifying form of evil is that which lurks within the human mind. Terror. From Robert Bloch, author of Psycho. Asylum. The prison of madness, where few enter and none return. Asylum. You have nothing to lose but your mind.
A young doctor arrives at an institution for the incurably insane and is told that his job interview consists of a single task: walk through the wards, listen to the patients, and correctly identify which one of them used to be the head psychiatrist before something in this place broke him permanently. Asylum arrived in 1972, directed by Roy Ward Baker and written by Robert Bloch, the man who wrote Psycho, and it is the film that represents Amicus Productions at the absolute peak of what the anthology format could do when every element of it was operating in the same direction at the same time. 4 stories, 4 patients, 4 completely different textures of dread, held together by a wraparound narrative that is not merely a delivery mechanism for the segments, but an active and genuinely unsettling piece of horror in its own right. Baker understood something about the anthology form that most directors working in it did not: that the stories do not exist in isolation, that each one changes the emotional temperature of the room the audience is sitting in, and that the wraparound narrative needs to earn its resolution rather than simply provide one. Robert Bloch adapted 4 of his own short stories for the screenplay, and brought to each of them the same quality that made Psycho endure: the understanding that the most durable horror is not located in the extraordinary, but in the precise moment when the ordinary reveals what has been living underneath it the entire time. A package that should not be opened. A tailor whose creations develop intentions of their own. A woman whose plan for her own freedom contains a flaw she cannot see until it is too late. And a man who builds small figures in a room alone at night, for reasons that the film takes its time revealing, and that land, when they arrive, with the specific weight of something that was inevitable from the first frame. The early 1970s were processing a deep cultural anxiety about the boundary between sanity and its absence, about who got to draw that line and whose interests were served by drawing it where it was drawn, and Asylum places that anxiety at the structural center of every story it tells without ever stating it directly. The moment that defines the film is not from any of the 4 segments. It is at the end of the wraparound, in the corridor, when the young doctor finally understands the answer to the question he was asked at the beginning, and realizes, in the same instant, that understanding it has not put him on the safe side of it. Baker holds the final image long enough for its full implication to settle, and the last thing the film shows you is not a monster or a revelation but a door, and what you understand about what is on the other side of it is entirely a function of what you have been paying attention to for the previous 88 minutes. Asylum featured Peter Cushing, Charlotte Rampling, Britt Eklund, and Herbert Lom, in a cast that represented some of the finest character work British cinema was producing in that decade, and it remains the most consistently realized of all the Amicus anthologies, the one where the format's inherent fragmentation becomes a source of cumulative dread rather than a limitation to be worked around. It has never been remade, and the very idea of remaking it feels wrong in the way that remaking a piece of architecture feels wrong, because what it does cannot be separated from the specific materials and proportions it was built with. What Asylum leaves behind is a structural question that its final image refuses to answer. In a place designed to contain the damage that broken minds can do, who exactly is doing the containing, and what happens to everyone inside when that distinction stops being reliable. Asylum spread its horror across 4 stories and 4 different human fractures, each one a different angle on the same essential darkness. The film that closes this list concentrates all of that into a single underground room, a single hooded figure, and 5 people who walked into a crypt as tourists, and are about to discover that the most frightening thing about knowing how your story ends is that knowing it changes absolutely nothing about what comes next.
Welcome to the crypt. invited on a guided tour of a world of darkness, where nightmares become reality. Death lives. Death lives. The vault of horror is about to open. You will learn its terrifying secrets. If you dare. Teacher. How to... Death lives in Tales from the Crypt. Who's next? Perhaps.
5 strangers follow a tour group into an ancient crypt and take a wrong turn. The group moves on without them, and in the chamber where they find themselves standing, a figure in dark robes steps forward and asks each one of them, with the patience of something that has been waiting in that room for a very long time, why they are there. Tales from the Crypt arrived in 1972, directed by Freddie Francis, and produced by Amicus Productions, and it is the film that defines what the British horror anthology was capable of at its most fully realized. 5 stories, 5 strangers, 5 completely different species of dread, each one built around a specific and irreversible human failure, and wrapped inside a framing narrative that earns its final revelation by making you work for it in a way that most horror films of the era simply did not bother to do. Milton Subotsky adapted the screenplay from EC Comics source material that had been considered too disturbing for mainstream American publication in the 1950s, and the film honors the comic's essential moral architecture faithfully. These are not stories about random misfortune or external evil. They are stories about people who made choices, and are now being shown, with complete and merciless precision, exactly what those choices cost. Joan Collins plays a woman whose Christmas Eve decision opens the door to something she cannot close again. Peter Cushing plays a gentle and persecuted neighbor, whose grief is used against him in a way that constitutes one of the most quietly devastating sequences in the decade's entire horror catalog. Patrick Magee plays a blind man whose treatment by the institution responsible for his care generates a response that the film presents not as villainous, but as geometrically exact. Each segment operates at a different emotional register, and each one lands with the specific weight of something that was coming from the first frame, which is the quality that separates genuine anthology horror from the kind that simply strings unrelated stories together and calls it a structure. The moment that does not leave anyone who sees it young enough is the Cushing segment, and it is not the moment of horror that defines it. It is the moment before, when Arthur Grimsdyke sits alone in his small house surrounded by the animals and children, who are the only company his neighbors have left him, reading the valentines that have arrived on his birthday. And Cushing plays the man's happiness with such unguarded and complete sincerity that what follows it lands not as a horror set piece, but as something closer to grief. Francis shoots the sequence with the same restraint, understanding that the accumulated weight of the man's goodness is doing more work than any amount of atmospheric lighting could, and that the horror of what comes next is inseparable from the specific quality of what preceded it. Peter Cushing later said that the role was therapeutic for him personally, that he had recently lost his wife, and that playing Grimsdyke helped him process something he was carrying that had no other outlet. That knowledge does not change what the performance is on screen. It deepens it. Tales from the Crypt spawned a sequel, Vault of Horror, released the following year, and eventually lent its title to the beloved HBO anthology series that introduced a new generation to the Crypt Keeper and to the essential moral logic of stories, where the punishment fits the crime with a precision that justice in the real world almost never manages. Neither the sequel nor the television series located exactly what the 1972 film had, which was the specific combination of moral weight, genuine craft, and the quiet certainty of Ralph Richardson's Crypt Keeper, a figure who is not cruel and not theatrical, but simply present, simply patient, simply the embodiment of an accounting that was always going to happen, and is now happening, and who watches each story unfold with the expression of someone who knew the ending before the beginning, and found neither surprising. What Tales from the Crypt leaves behind is the question at the center of all 5 of its stories, and at the center of the framing narrative that contains them. If you were shown, with complete accuracy and in precise detail, the full consequence of every choice you are about to make, would you make different ones? And the film's final image suggests, with a gentleness that is more unsettling than any amount of overt menace, that you already know the answer to that. Outro 7 films. 7 different rooms inside the same darkness, and not one of them finished with you when the credits rolled. That is the thing about the supernatural horror films of the 1970s that no other decade has managed to replicate with the same consistency. They were not interested in scaring you and sending you home. They were interested in leaving something behind. A residue, a weight. A question that sits at the back of your mind in the particular silence that follows a film that knew exactly what it was doing and did it without apology. Ruby left you with the understanding that the dead do not require your belief in order to collect what they are owed. Peter Proud left you with the vertigo of a man who traveled across the country to escape something that was traveling inside him the entire time. The Manitou left you with the image of ancient fury working its way back into a world that had spent centuries pretending it was gone. The Psychic left you with the specific helplessness of almost enough information. The Medusa touch left you with a man in a hospital bed and a television screen, and the absolute stillness of something that has never needed to hurry. Asylum left you in a corridor with a door, and the full implication of what is on the other side of it. And Tales from the Crypt left you in a crypt with a hooded figure who was never going to let you leave until you understood what you had already chosen. None of these films were really about the supernatural. They were about the things that the 1970s understood with a particular and hard-won clarity, that the past does not stay where you put it, that the bodies and histories and grievances buried beneath the foundations of ordinary life have a patience that outlasts every institution built to contain them, and that the forces moving through the world are not impressed by your inability to perceive them. These were films made for a generation that had watched its most trusted authorities fail in public and in real time, and that had arrived at a working understanding that the line between the world as it presented itself and the world as it actually operated was considerably thinner than anyone in a position of power preferred to acknowledge. The supernatural in these films is not a departure from reality. It is reality with the polite surface removed. So here is what I need to know from you. Which one of these stayed? Not the one you are supposed to say, not the one with the biggest reputation or the most recognizable title. The one that followed you out of the room, the one that made you think about something you had not thought about in a long time, or think about something familiar in a way that made it suddenly unfamiliar. Drop it in the comments, and tell me when you first saw it, and whether you were alone. Because I have a feeling that for most of you, the answer to that. Second question is yes. If this list found something you had been carrying without knowing it, hit like. It takes 1 second, and it tells me that this kind of deep-cut content is worth continuing. Subscribe if you want to be here for what comes next, because the next video is going somewhere that this one only pointed toward the supernatural horror films of the 1970s that never found their audience on release, that spent decades in the margins of the conversation, and that are now being discovered by a new generation of viewers who are finding in them exactly what the decade that made them was trying to say. Some of those films are going to be very familiar to you. Some of them are going to be names you have never heard. All of them are going to stay.
Subscribe for the next nightmare.